Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah, and welcome back to this series of programs called The Parables from Exile to Return. And that concept of exile is very important. So you all remember going back to the Babylonian captivity, which King Nebuchadnezzar came to the land of Israel, took the best and the brightest of Judah back to the land of Babylon, which is approximately 586 BCE. He destroyed the temple, he conquered the city, etc. That happens to be probably one of the most important events in all of the history of Israel. That so shook them to the core. Think about it. There they'd been in the land for a long time. They had crossed over with Joshua, and we had gone through the judges, and we went through the period of the monarchy, and of course we had King Saul, and then we moved into King David, and from King David on to his son King Solomon, and we go down through the kings. So everything was great. God gave David the design and plan for the temple, and Solomon was the one, his son, who would actually build the temple from the great cedars of Lebanon. And this was the glorious temple. It was magnificent. It was like a diamond sitting on a hill, on a mountain, just exuding light to the whole world. This was ground zero for the land and for the people. And the temple functioned as their sacred center, where everything functioned, if you will, from that sphere. Their whole entire economic life, the judicial life, the spiritual life of Israel all took place in the temple. And there they went, and they went up to the temple for the festivals, and they worshiped God and brought their offerings. It's where commercially everything functioned from that point. The king ruled and reigned there. And this went on for centuries, until this time where the king of Babylon came in and destroyed it. He destroyed the entire national life of Israel. He destroyed everything that they held dear. He upended their entire existence. It was as though even within that, they lost their entire identity. And so the exile of Israel, Judah in particular, out of the land at that time becomes one of the focal points of all of the Bible and really of the history of Israel. And so it's important for us to consider that as Yeshua is talking to the folks. Think of it, they are back in the land, right, after many centuries, but they are still in exile, if you will, because now they are in their land, but they are under the thumb. They are being controlled and oppressed by not only Rome, but by their own leader, King Herod and his sons to follow, and even by the temple leadership. So the people are still not free. Now, Herod, we know, has rebuilt the temple, which goes back to the Hasmonean period. They continued to add on. And King Herod extended the temple to its greatest, to the greatest extent at that time. In spite of all that, the people were not free. And so along comes Yeshua, and he gives a message of how to be free and how the kingdom is functioning and how the kingdom is to go forth and what the kingdom is compared to. But they're not running the show. And so this idea of exile and return becomes extremely important in the Bible. And of course we know it would be under King Cyrus, the Persian king, who would issue the decree to enable the children of Israel to go back to the land. Now the point of going back to the land was to rebuild the temple. Now, and what was the purpose of that? It was to rebuild a house for the presence of God, because they simply could not function without their king in their presence, without the presence of God bringing blessing and fertility, etc., to the land. All of the history becomes very important in understanding where they were at what particular time, whether there was a temple standing or not. Now we understand most of the people did not go back to the land. Remember, they come through the Babylonian period, and now they're under the Persian kings, and there's a bunch of different kings following King Cyrus. And he's, of course, the one that allows them to go back and rebuild. They don't actually rebuild for quite a while. It's probably not till 515 BCE that the temple is actually is finished. And there's some argument over those dates as well. But that's the point of the return. The point of the return is to rebuild the house. The point of them going back to the land is to rebuild the house as a place for the presence of God. That is so their king could sit on his throne in the midst of them. And so what was the purpose of the king seated on the throne? That was to bring order. So they had lived in a state of chaos for a very long time, in which the enemies of God were ruling the world. From Nebuchadnezzar on down to the Medo-Persian Empire, down to the Greek Empire, into the Roman Empire. These were all enemies of the King of Kings. And so for a very long time, God was, as though as king, was really not in their presence. And yet he is the one who would bring order and stability to that place. We talked some last time about the idea that in the ancient world they saw the cosmos as a kingdom. That is how the kingdom in the ancient world operated based on cosmic elements. So the ancient cosmology, for example, was always designed in what we would consider to be a three-tiered structure of the universe. Every temple in the ancient world was patterned after that. So that structure, actually, of the kingdom was heaven, earth, and sea. And of course, in the ancient world, the gods lived in the heavenly realms, in the heavenly sphere, and the kings ruled on the earth. And so we have a little bit of a similarity here with, if we look at Israel, and actually if we go back to Adam, because Adam was to rule as a king over the earth from the garden, which all kings had gardens attached to their temples. But the structure of the kingdom was heaven, earth, and sea. And that will become important as we look at the parables as well. Just each sphere would be filled with elements. So, for example, the heavenlies would be filled with the orbs, the sun, the moon, the stars, etc. The earth would be filled with fruit-producing seed and trees. And, of course, we have animals and mankind, etc. And then the sphere of the seas was the outer boundary. It was not part of the sacred space. It was part of the outer boundary. And of course, we have described the fish in the sea, etc. And on the fifth day, we have the sea monsters described. So this is the way that the earth, the heaven, the earth, and the sea were structured as a cosmic temple. And so this is how the world functioned at that time. This is the way it was structured. And this is how it operated. And this isn't really how we approach that. We don't really see that in much the same way. So in the ancient world, the gods, their sphere, their domain was the heavens. So, for example, over a city, you would have a god over that particular city. He or she would determine who the king would be of that city. The king was responsible to build a temple for that god, and the god would kind of come and go. He would visit and then disappear back into his heavenly realms. Now, you recognize in the ancient world that there were a lot of gods, and even over one city there could be multiple gods. And there were gods for everything and everywhere, and lots of them. And so it was interesting in that culture and time in which Israel was the only nation that unified all aspects of deity, if you will, within one God. This is very significant. So within our God, Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, within him, he is one. The nature of our God is one, whereas the nature of all these other gods is multiple gods, multiple attributes. Each god had its own attribute. So I guess when you brought the whole pantheon together, you had the whole enchilada, if you will. But for Israel was created a nation under one God. And within that God, Yod He Vav He, all of the deity, all of the attributes function within him. This is why the declaration that the Jews have to declare that God is one is part of the kingship language. You might be familiar, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And so Israel's God is one, stands completely apart from the gods of the ancient world. And Yeshua in his parables is trying to make that same kind of, is communicating the same thing through the stories that he tells in the parables. Now, if we look at a particular verse in Psalm 78:2, and it says, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter many things, or I will utter things hidden since the foundation of the world. That comes from Psalm 78:2. Now, honestly, that sounds very cryptic, very otherworldly. What on earth is it talking about? So when we start to understand that the foundation of the world upon which God built the cosmos, if we begin to understand that the cosmos was a kingdom, this all has to do with king and kingship, kingdom type language. And so the idea of speaking forth the parables have everything to do with, we mentioned last time, the Hebrew word mashal, which means dominion or rulership. So the language of parable has to do with dominion and rulership. And so it is making a declaration from the beginning of who God is and how it is he. The other nations, the other kingdoms all had creation stories. That was very common. How did the world come forth? They had their creation stories. The other kingdoms recognized their own gods as part of the builders of the cosmos. So this is familiar language, but God is declaring that he is the foundation of the world, that it is his cosmic house that is the kingdom that is ruled by the King of Kings, and that this kingdom operates 180 degrees out of phase from the kingdoms of this world. The kingdoms of this world are built on lies, on deceit, on oppression, on enslavement. That's how they expand their kingdom, through military conquest. The kingdom of our God is built on truth. The kingdom of our God is built on those that humble themselves will be exalted. The kingdoms of this world are built on lift yourself up and oppress everyone else and enslave the folks. Again, it is into this environment that Yeshua came. Imagine what the folks were dealing with at this time under Rome. Rome was the most powerful empire, bar none, since the beginning of the world. And the kings, the Caesars of Rome, raised themselves up or exalted themselves to become as the gods, and so oppressed the people. It was a very violent, vicious time, the Empire of Rome, and it is under this time that the people are enslaved to the Roman world and the things that went on there. I would encourage you, if you have an interest, to read about ancient Rome, the imperial cult, what all that meant. What personally, as bad as things are, and they seem to be now, I would rather live in this generation than live back at the time of the first century under the rule, under the dominion of the Roman world, which was oppressive beyond anything we can even imagine. And so the idea of the foundation of the world being built by the king, by our God, and in his kingdom being raised up, is in contradistinction from the kingdoms and the nations of the world. I mentioned last time as well, this is the conflict that we see throughout the Bible, this conflict between two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the nations. And so that battle goes on, and so Yeshua is entering into this whole environment, and he is declaring his Father. He is the one who built the house, the cosmic house. And he has stepped into this, and he is their king, their Messiah. And he operates out of love, and he operates in a way that extends freedom and deliverance to the captives. He sets them free from Roman rule, from the physical enslavement that they have experienced. It's through this. Now, certainly he's going to set them free from themselves, and it's not as though they are actually, they don't have the luxury of living in a country such as ours, where they are able to purchase property and start businesses. Many did, of course, but most of the average folks were poor and unable to do this kind of things, and they were enslaved under all of the laws governing the Roman Empire. So this battle, once again, becomes very important. Now, another area that I'd like to talk about in terms of this building of the house, we've said how the Proverbs, Hebrew mishle, comes from the root mashal, means to have dominion or rulership. But within the Proverbs, we have instructions on how to build a solid house, how to build a house that won't collapse, how to build a house that isn't in chaos. And the instructions and the information in there is vital if you want to build a happy house, if you want to build a house that nothing is going to shake. And we can see that as we look around our world today, a world of total dysfunction. And the number one place where that dysfunction comes from is in the home. Many homes are not functioning according to what God has established as a home that is prosperous, that brings blessing, and that where the home continues to reproduce, not just physically, but in a home that is bringing forth life to the sphere in which it finds itself, a home that brings a positive influence to the world around it. And so the language of house building has to do with covenant making, which of course Yeshua came, his blood was shed as a covenant to bring two parties together, to restore the relationship between God and man. And so this is how a house is built, is when a covenant is made. And in the ancient world, there were multiple covenants. One of the most important covenants was a covenant that was made between the king and his servant, or we could argue the father and his son. Those are actually synonymous terms. And so the king would pass down to his son would inherit the throne, the son would inherit all that the king had, the son would inherit the land in which the king ruled over, that would become the son's. And so this language of covenant is very important for house building. Now, in its just root form, to build a house, to make a covenant, simply means that something is divided into two and then joined together to produce life. So the best example we would have would be Adam and Eve. If you'll recall, they are as if one unit. They're cut, brit, to make a covenant, separated in order for the two to join together and to become one and produce fruit. And that is the nature of a covenant. So in the book of Proverbs, what we would call, and this extends to the parables, this is what we call wisdom language. And so it is, wisdom is how you make, through wisdom is how a house is made strong. How a house can fight against the forces that will come against it to destroy it. Wisdom is the predominant attribute, if you will, that will strengthen that house and prevent those forces from destroying it and returning the house to chaos. Again, everything, the nature of the kingdoms of this world is to bring about chaos and to destroy everything in its sight. It's going back to the garden and Adam violating the covenant of God and taking from the tree and eating the fruit and producing chaos. And so the house, what happens to him when he produces that chaos? He is exiled from the garden. And so Israel, if you will, over time has been exiled in a number of times, from the land to Egypt, from the land to Babylon, and ultimately, of course, at the time of the Romans, the temple is destroyed and the people are sent into the diaspora, to the four corners of the earth. So this exile from the presence of God, this is the goal of the enemies, to destroy the house. So we have this conflict between these two kingdoms shows up in the book of Proverbs as well. And so the contrast between the wise and the wisdom of the wise and the foolish, or the folly of the foolish. We have these two. So the kingdoms of this world were pictures of like a harlot who was foolish, who produced folly, versus the kingdom of our God. Has to do with the idea of wisdom, how a king would rule with wisdom. So King Solomon is a good example of that. And so when Israel puts herself under the thumb because of her sin, because of violating the covenant, she puts herself under empires. It's as though she's having a extramarital relationship. She's acting the harlot. She is the whore, if you will. And so this language, that's folly, the foolishness of the harlot is what destroys the house. And Israel played the harlot and destroyed her own house because she violated the covenant, because the covenant would make the house strong, where the two would become one. So we're going to talk about that probably a little more in our next session. But this is the language, this covenant language of where two become one. They together become strong. If they operate their house with wisdom, they can push back the forces that would come against the house to destroy it. So we've talked about a little bit, introduced this idea of the harlot and the virgin. We'll see this language all through the Bible. Of course, you might think of one of the parables that Yeshua told of the 10 virgins, and then some of them are wise and some of them are foolish. And so that is the language of parable. That is the language that comes from the book of Proverbs. That is the language of how do you build a strong house. And the context for that particular parable, if you will, has to do with the temple and how the temple is built. And we'll be talking about that when we actually look at that particular proverb. So it is that the harlotry of Israel is what tears down the house and destroys the house. And really, it's not hard to see when there's an extramarital affair in a marriage. It's not just the destruction of the marriage, it's the destruction of everything around the marriage. They say that for every divorce, it doesn't affect just the man and the woman, and certainly and the children, but it affects upwards of 300 people. So for every divorce that takes place, it affects 300 other people, and not in a positive way. So this association of Israel playing the harlot by joining to the other nations, by rejecting her God, and by violating the covenant and breaking the covenant that she has made with God, puts her in this situation in which she plays the harlot and does not exercise wisdom but exercises foolishness. And this is the thing that tears down the house. And again, it's into this environment that Yeshua begins to share these different types of parables, because his goal is to build up the house and to restore it. And so though they've come back from exile and they're in the land, they still need to be set free, because physically they're under Roman rule. And how can they be set free? Well, it's going to be by the blood that he shed in order for a covenant to be made between the two. And he mediates the covenant between God and his people. And so the idea of wisdom, the wisdom is what builds the house. And the wisdom, it was said, was what we would call one of the divine attributes of the kings. And so the kings, again, everything goes back to how they rule. Do they rule with wisdom, or do they rule in foolishness? So when a bad king came to power and he broke the covenant with his God, things returned to a state of chaos, disorder came, and the life of the folks was in jeopardy. Things did not go well. And we can see that to a degree. In present day, you look at a nation when fools, rule over a nation, when people who are walking outside the covenant, when people break the covenant, when people are walking outside what the Torah commands. And ultimately, if you look at the Ten Commandments, if one were to measure and follow their life after the Ten Commandments, that would bring restoration and healing to a nation. Our nation has moved far from that, and now we are reaping the whirlwind. We are seeing the chaos coming from every side because many of us live in communities with bad kings. Many of us live in states with bad rulers. And that, I'm not going to mention any state in particular, but with that, I think a type of insanity comes in, and these kings are operating out of that place. And so it's, again, into this environment in which Yeshua comes in the first century, because how they're operating is destroying and is a heavy weight on the people and is bringing about destruction and chaos. And it's into that environment that Yeshua comes to bring order and to bring life and to restore the dignity of the people. And even though they're oppressed by an external enemy, he is going to give them a deliverance to make them free and to allow them that they would come into the presence of the King once again and be delivered and set free. So it is an amazing thing, and it's important that we look at the historical backdrop if we have any hope of understanding what Yeshua is communicating. Though it seems like a mystery, it actually has everything to do with the kingdom of heaven. So thanks for joining me in this session, and we will see you next time as we talk more about the parables of God, exile to return. Shalom.